Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Before we begin, just a reminder to please silence your cell phones. Thank you. My name is Faraj Atwi, and I am a second-year political science undergraduate student at the University of Denver. Thank you for joining us for America's Role in the World, the Future of Alliances. I am delighted to introduce Ambassador Christopher Hill, who is currently the Chief Global Advisor at the University of Denver. Prior to this position, he was the Dean of the Josef Korbel School of International Studies. Ambassador Hill came to the Korbel School after a 33-year career in the Foreign Service. After serving a Peace Corps volunteer in Cameroon, he moved on to the State Department. He was ambassador for 4 countries, Iraq, Poland, Korea, and Macedonia, and served as an Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Ambassador Hill also led the U.S. nuclear disarmament negotiating team with North Korea. Please join me now in welcoming Ambassador Christopher Hill.
Thank you. Well, let's wait. Let's get the panel up. Ben, do you know where you are? You're Ben, Michael, David, Torrey. Well, great to see you all here today. I know most people would have preferred maybe just to talk about John Bolton's demise today. I could spend several hours on the subject, but I really think we ought to go back to what are the problems in the world. And first of all, I just want to thank the Koch Institute and Brookings Institution for making this all possible, for gathering 4 really top-notch scholars. And we've divided them into teams, 2 teams, and they'll be viciously competing with each other, and then we'll figure out who won, or at least we can talk about it in the cocktail party. But I think we are just delighted to have these 2 teams of 2 scholars each, and to talk about I've kind of informally labeled this sort of all the problems in the world. We're not going to talk about anything good in the world. So if those of you who need good news, you're in the wrong room here. So we're going to discuss a lot of these things. I'm going to be posing questions, and they're going to be giving really pithy answers in about a 2-minute time frame. And then we'll kind of add it all up, and then we'll get audience questions. Now, as you know, you've all had little pencils that you can fill in a question. For those of you who usually like to come here and tell speeches, you just keep writing, and we'll read the whole thing, whole speech. But the idea is to try to get as many of these questions as possible. So let me. I want to start with to introduce the two panels. The first group is consists of Ben Friedman and David Hendrickson, and the second group is Michael Beckley and Torrey Taussig. So let me start by introducing, starting with my immediate left, Ben Friedman, who is an adjunct lecturer at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. He graduated from Dartmouth College, PhD candidate in political science at MIT. Previously worked as a defense analyst at the Cato Institute, researcher in the Center for Defense Information. He's edited 3 books on defense policy and strategy, published academic essays in international security, political science, quarterly, just every publication in the world, it seems. Ben has done Boston Review, Boston Herald, Boston Globe, Newsweek, Time. What else do you do in life? Do you have anything else?
There's some other projects I didn't finish while I was doing it.
Oh, okay. Okay. Anyway, we're very.
Now I'm policy director at Defense Priorities.
And now you're policy director at Defense Priorities. So thank you very much, Ben. And so I'm going to introduce the other three people, and then we're going to start with 3-minute sort of introductions by each of them, and then we'll go to questions. So the second panelist on Ben's immediate left is Michael Beckley. He's an associate professor of political science at Tufts University. His research, he does research on U.S.-China relations, received awards from the American Political Science Association, International Studies Association. He's been in numerous media, including the Times, NPR, Washington Post. He's also previously worked at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, U.S. Department of Defense, RAND Corporation, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And he continues to be an advisor in the Intel community in the U.S. Department of Defense. He holds a PhD from Columbia, and his first book, Unrivaled, Why America Will Remain the World's Sole Superpower, was published in 2018. So we're very pleased to have Michael here. Again, I don't know how these people find time to watch a baseball game or something, but they are just extraordinarily busy. Then we go to, I think we're going to have David Hendrickson.
Don't forget about me.
Yeah. David, I think many of you know David. He's a professor of political science at Colorado College. He's been teaching there for a while, really, since 1983. He's authored 8 books. His PhD is from Johns Hopkins University immediately before he came to Colorado College. He's co-authored 3 books with Robert Tucker, one on Thomas Jefferson's foreign policy, Jefferson, our first Secretary of State, and he's authored another on the cause of American War of Independence, third called The Imperial Temptation, New World Order, America's Purpose. He was born and raised in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and he's lived here in Colorado since 1983. So, David, I think you know a lot of our professors here, and we certainly know you, and we're delighted you came up through the traffic on Route 25. Apparently, in the 22nd century, they're envisioning another lane, and that you will then be able to speed your way up through the traffic jams. Finally, I am looking for Torrey's bio here. Torrey
I can
is
do it. It's short.
Torrey Taussig, a non-resident fellow at the Foreign Policies Program Center for the United States and Europe at Brookings. In 2018-19, based in Berlin at the Robert Bosch Foundation Fellow. As a Robert Bosch Foundation Fellow, she's worked on U.S. foreign policy, European and Asian security, authoritarian politics, there's a lot of that these days, and U.S.-Russian relations. She was a pre- and postdoctoral fellow at the Brookings Institute. She has also worked at the Department of State, Glover Park Group, and the Council on Foreign Relations. She's worked on a number of other research areas, including 21st century revisionist statecraft, great power competition between the U.S., Russia, and China, global trends in democracy and authoritarianism. Her articles and papers have appeared in numerous journals, including in the Belfer Center of the Harvard Kennedy School, The Diplomat, and other publications. She has a doctorate from Fletcher School and received a master's from Fletcher School and a bachelor in political science and economics from Williams College. So I think these are extremely well-qualified people to discuss some of these issues, and given the time constraints and the desire to get through a lot of these issues going on in the world today, I think I'll turn to start with, first of all, ask them to each do a 3-minute sort of burst, and then we'll go to some of the questions. So Ben, why don't you take it away?
I think that we've forgotten in the United States what alliances are for. Mostly we act as if they're not for anything, as if they're permanent ends in themselves that measure our virtue, our commitment to internationalism, or our global power. But military alliances are a means to security. They're a threat to kill a large number of people on behalf of another group of people, and they should be examined, not worshipped. U.S. alliances were created for the most part to help weaker states balance against stronger ones, to keep the peace and prevent the emergence of a hegemon that could dominate Eurasia, Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, and we feared that could threaten us somehow. U.S. commitments to major alliances no longer balance power. They provide what the national security strategy calls a favorable balance of power, which is to say an imbalance of power. They are a means to dominate not only our adversaries but our allies rather than a means to balance. They persist without the kind of threat that made them a Eurasian hegemon for a variety of reasons we can get into. But today, I think our allies could do a lot more to balance without our help. David, my partner in debating here, will talk more about the economic and even moral costs of alliances, and I want to just bring up now a couple pathologies they create. One is free riding and infantilization. If our allies can spend less because we're providing defense for them, they can spend more on other things on which the U.S. taxpayer is effectively paying for. That's not only unfair, it's a means to infantilize our allies such that they don't develop the capabilities to be true partners. And I'm thinking here most of all of the European Union, which has been deliberately hobbled through the United States, through the NATO alliance. We don't want the European Union to be a brother like us that can say no. We want it to be a little brother that will go places and do things. We do that through NATO. Another pathology is moral hazard, where our protection allows some reckless driving on behalf of our allies, where they maybe drag us into trouble rather than becoming a stabilizing force. I think recent Saudi behavior is a good example. A related phenomenon is entrapment, where we are pushed into wars that aren't in our interests because we think over time that we expand our idea of our interests over time because of our ally, because of credibility concerns in particular. Vietnam is an example. Another example of a pathology is temptation. Advocates of alliances say, well, you know, the garrisons that we have around the world are useful because they help us fight other wars in places like the Middle East. Our side of the debate says, yeah, that's a problem, not a benefit. We don't want to fight those wars. We want to adopt the view that our founders took, that wars should be hard to start. So let's make it a little more deliberate when we have them. And finally, our alliances cause spirals. U.S. offensive striking power is so potent that they frighten our adversaries into doing things that we don't like building nuclear weapons, and can create arms races and poison diplomacy. If our allies did more, we could, to some extent, avoid those problems or at least limit them. So solving those problems, just to end, solving those problems doesn't require wholesale abandonment of our allies. I think it requires a recalibration where we adopt a much more defensive and long-distance approach to defending our allies, and then we'd be somewhat better off before we talk later about whether or not some of these alliances should ultimately end. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Ben. And now we'll go to Michael, speaking for the other team.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me. Since I'm batting leadoff for the Alliance's good team, I thought I'd start by making a pretty simple, but what I think is an often overlooked point. Namely that we are living right now in the most peaceful, prosperous, and democratic era in history, and U.S. alliances have played a role in making that happen and continue to play a role in making that happen. So while I think we can reform U.S. alliances to address some of the points that Ben just raised, I think we need to do so in ways that are careful not to throw the good out with the bad. So let me just spell out some of these good effects of alliances. One is, I think, the evidence is pretty clear that alliances on balance have promoted peace. So over the last 70 years, the number of wars and the number of people killed in warfare has declined more than tenfold. And nearly all of that decline has taken place where and when the United States has maintained standing security guarantees. And we have documented cases where these alliances have deterred aggression from revisionist powers like Russia, China, North Korea. We have cases where these alliances turned former enemies into peaceful partners, whether it's France and Germany, Japan and South Korea. There's also cases where alliances have enabled the United States to restrain its partners from starting stupid fights with regional powers. So whether it's restraining Taiwan vis-a-vis China or restraining Poland vis-a-vis Russia. So as a result of all these mechanisms, the regions that for most of modern history were actually the most war-torn regions in the world are now relative zones of peace. The second point is prosperity. So over the last 70 years, more wealth has been created in the world than in all of human history combined. And the United States and its allies have accounted for more than 70% of this wealth creation. And that's not a coincidence. US alliances have increased prosperity by creating a secure environment where business can take place. You're just much more likely to trade with your neighbor if you don't have to worry that they're going to try to kill you later on. You're much more likely to invest in things if you're confident your assets aren't going to be reduced to rubble in some horrible war. So alliances have provided stability, this type of stability, for dozens of countries, and as a result, commerce among them has flourished. The last point I want to make is about democracy. Nearly all of the liberal democracies in the world are US allies, and again, this is not a coincidence. People tend to support strongmen and turn their backs on democracy when they feel threatened militarily or in terms of their security, or they feel stressed economically. So by keeping the lid on conflicts, by boosting commerce, US alliances have at least indirectly shored up and helped consolidate democracy in certain regions. So I agree probably with the other team to some extent that the US alliance network needs some reform around the edges, but I think as we debate how to reform these alliances, we need to keep in mind how much good they've done over the last 70 years, and so our goal should be reform, not outright rejection. Thanks.
David?
I wasn't sure if there would be visual displays today, but just in case, I brought a Sharpie. I want to say, if the other team brings out a map, Alabama is the least of their worries once I get done. So I want to address 4 themes about what alliances are for, what the American role in the world is about, and assess them in relationship to security, prosperity, liberty, and justice. And all 4 of those things are fundamental human goods. Every state in the world, all the peoples of the world, I think, despite their many differences, have a yearning for those things. And all of those fundamental goods are deeply associated with the founding of our country, and our founding fathers spoke eloquently about all of them. And I think our alliances, though they did accomplish many great things in the past, particularly in the rebuilding of the world after the Second World War, have become very questionable, very problematic in terms of each of those goods. Security. The biggest threat to American security is that we're going to get into another war with another great power. And there are a lot of dangers associated with that we've tended to forget. Those nuclear weapons are still there. And moreover, we have new arenas of competition with cyber warfare and such that are very dangerous. And we face adversaries that are pretty tough customers. So the idea that we're going to prevail any kind of conflict with China has to be just dismissed as absurd. They could do us a lot of damage, as we could do to them. But we don't want to do that. And we need to be careful about the confrontations that we may have with China. I won't speak too much about prosperity. I think that it's pretty obvious that we've been building a lot of roads in Afghanistan, and we can't fix I-25, can we? Let's do that. I mean, we subsidize allies, and they provide free university education to their young people. We force our young people to go into debt. I think that's wrong, and we need to readjust. Liberty. We have a very big national security apparatus. I would say that the NSA and all of the intelligence services cost $75 billion a year or something like that, far in excess of other countries, but we don't really know what the cost is because it's secret. And that apparatus of power is dangerous to liberty. I think anyone can see that. I've run out of time. Justice, that makes us think, are we applying the rules in an impartial way across the world? In the Middle East, do our allies follow the rules of the United Nations Charter in their uses of force? Do the Saudis do that in Yemen? Do the Israelis do that when they bomb Lebanon, Syria, Iraq? I don't think so. And we have problems on that score too, having conducted an illegal war against Iraq in 2003. Those are 4 fundamental values, and we need to assess our role in the world in relationship to them.
Thank you. Torrey, your batting cleanup there.
Thank you. I'd like to use 5 of my seconds just to say that it's a privilege to be here, and it's very nice to see you all. I look forward to having a glass of wine with you after. I'm still on Europe time, just returning from Berlin. I want to pick up on what Michael said. He mentioned that we're living in a time, in an era that is the most peaceful, prosperous, and democratic that modern history has seen. And I agree with that, and I actually think we are at a crossroads where 2 concurrent realities are moving this international system that the United States has helped to develop down a dangerous path. And these 2 realities make American alliances and America's role in the world all the more important, probably more so than any time since the end of the Cold War, perhaps any time since the end of World War II. This first reality is, and I'm sure this is not lost on this crowd, the return of great power competition, the return of regional power plays, aggression from great power states, Russia, China being foremost among them, who are willing to use military force and economic coercion to leverage their smaller neighbor states. And I think this will continue without credible deterrence and pushback. China, in particular, will be the most important relationship that the United States has to manage in the decades ahead, and it will do so with the credibility of its existence alliances being reformed around the edges. I agree with Michael on that. The second concurrent reality that American alliances and a strong American role in the world is needed for is the rise of authoritarianism around the world. We are not just seeing a deepening of authoritarianism within strong states such as Russia and China. We're also seeing worrying trends that brought about Europe and the United States' darkest hours in the 20th century: protectionism, nationalism, dictatorship. These are on the rise in regions around the world. And again, not just in these countries, but also in our own society. And if countries with which America shares deep-seated values become increasingly isolated from one another, if the United States chooses to turn inward, to divest from diplomacy, if we become so fractured in our own societies that we can't even agree on threats to our democratic institutions, let alone our national security and our alliance partners, then these forces will continue to grow. So I think we are at a crossroads. Looking ahead to the next 10 years, if these trends continue, revisionist power plays from Russia, China, the resurgence of authoritarianism, we'll see a continuation of polarizing societies, decreasing trust within and between states, reducing economic interdependence, which has led to global economic growth in recent decades, and the potential increase of possibility of conflict. But there is a possible potential solution, and it revolves reforming around the edges this international system, which has served American interests well in recent decades. It can lead to deeper economic integration, better political ties, and importantly, the deterrence power that American power within strong alliances is a united front against continued aggression.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, this is how we're going to proceed. We're going to talk about this alliance issue first in a kind of general way for the next few minutes. Then we're going to go to Europe, Asia, and finally Persian Gulf. Again, nothing good happening anywhere, but that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to start with Ben, because Ben, I may have missed this, but I had the impression that when you were talking about some of these alliance partners, you're saying we're kind of putting them into a position where they're sort of niche players and can't sort of handle all the aspects of defense. That is, they're being allowed to get away with kind of just doing certain narrow things. If I missed that, that's what I picked up. And I guess my question is, does it make sense that we should look as the purpose of alliances, that our perspective on alliances should be the same as, say, Slovenia's? I mean, does it make sense that Slovenia should be building up a military with tank formations and things like that? Or should we be sort of understanding that we'll look at these alliances, we'll have a different perspective on being in the same alliance?
Well, it's natural that states and alliances will have different perspectives and different approaches to the threat. So states in Eastern Europe, I think, are strangely, revealingly, relatively unconcerned, especially states in Central and Western Europe, about the Russian threat. We yell at them to spend more money to balance Russia. They don't. Why don't they? Well, they don't see as bad a threat as we do. So I think it's not my view that we need to get them to do more, to yell at them as President Trump does and other presidents have done more politely, to spend more. It's my view that what we want them to do is deal independently as much as possible with the threats. And if they decide that they don't have to spend very much, that's fine with me. And I think we should do less to defend them, and we'll get along better in that world where we don't have to yell at them and they feel relatively secure.
Okay.
And that does lead me to another point I wanted to make real quickly, which is that people confuse good diplomatic relationships with having a military alliance where you threaten to kill a large number of Russians or Chinese people on behalf of your ally. And we can have good relations with countries in the world without threatening essentially mass murder on their behalf. We should take these promises, these massive nuclear promises, more seriously. We hand out these promises like friendship bracelets to Montenegro, North Macedonia. It's become a joke. I have nothing against those countries, but they add nothing to the alliance, and it's a little bit unclear to me why we should threaten such destructive results on their behalf. So, and I don't think it actually does very much for them because they don't have direct threats. They have more internal threats. But I'll leave it there, and I hope I can respond later to what Mike and Torrey said.
Oh, absolutely. I think, all right, let's go to Michael, and this is a kind of a broad question. Often you hear, in terms of the U.S. Alliances, the word credibility comes up a lot. And the view that somehow, if we didn't come to Montenegro's defense, and by the way, Montenegro was kind of targeted by the Russians a couple of years ago. And the question is, if we don't come to their defense, do we lose credibility? And I guess the broader question is, what role does credibility play, and how much should we devote to it? I mean, is this going, in the case of NATO, Article 5? I mean, what's the role of credibility?
Yeah, and I think to Ben's point, it's certainly not possible to defend every ally and every inch of every ally under every single circumstance. The United States just simply doesn't have that kind of power, and that could drag it into a lot of horrible wars. But I do think it is possible to honor the spirit of these alliance commitments, but do so in sort of creative, proportional ways. And one reason is the United States, at the end of the day, America's allies tend to need the United States more than vice versa, so the U.S. has some bargaining leverage.
You're saying
to dictate the
Slovenia needs us more than we need Slovenia?
You might say that. Okay. I also think that the alliance agreements themselves also provide some wiggle room. So they don't say the United States has to come out guns blazing every time a U.S. ally is besmirched by a foreign adversary. They say things like, we need to meet the common danger in line with our interests and our constitutional processes. So what I think the key to maintain credibility but not go so far over the edge that you're just running amok internationally is to have some type of pre-crisis clarity with each one of your allies, where you say, look, we are going to help you bolster your capabilities in peacetime, and should some conflict break out, we will help backstop the local balance of power, but we'll do so in ways of our choosing, through gradual escalation. It may not even be military intervention. The United States has a whole range of tools that don't require waging thermonuclear war on the Russians or the Chinese at the outset of a crisis. There's things like sanctions, cyber attacks, diplomatic poo-pooing, as well as military options like resupply or targeting or limited strikes that don't require this type of massive escalation. So the bottom line is the United States has a lot of options, and throughout its history, it's chosen a variety of those options to honor the spirit of its alliance commitments without getting dragged into horrible wars that it has no interest fighting.
Could I just respond to that?
Please.
As part of mine. There's a couple of points that we have to bear in mind, and one is that when you have an array of global commitments, it's very difficult to pivot among them. Obama tried that. He was going to pivot to Asia. Did he? Well, no, not really, because he faced crises in the Middle East and in Europe, and we were there. We had our commitments. We couldn't get away. And once you've made a commitment, it's very difficult, I think the history of statecraft shows, to then say, oh, sorry, never mind. We're not going to be engaged. You are engaged. Your credibility is engaged, and your credibility is engaged across the map. That means escalation. That means sticking with it, doing more, getting after it. And that also means that you can't really pick and choose which region you're going to focus on and pivot here and pivot there, because that depends on what your adversary does. What makes that especially problematic now and very difficult is that the United States does not have the alliance system that it did during the Cold War. NATO's twice as big. Our strategic frontier against Russia is, how many miles to the east? Very far, say 700, 800 miles to the east. And yet still it's the great geopolitical threat that's going to conquer Europe. Well, that's nonsense. I mean, the Russians had 35 million men under arms in the Second World War. Their military today is 1 million. There's a huge difference, and there's a huge difference in the willingness, ability, desire of the Russian people to participate in anything like that. So even were Putin to try some kind of grand enterprise, he would face a revolt at home, and he knows that. That's how the Soviet Union fell in the first place, their foreign misadventure in Afghanistan.
So, Torrey, what do you think? Should we be extending Article 5 guarantees to such members as North Macedonia and Estonia?
I think these questions about Montenegro, North Macedonia, Slovenia, Estonia miss seeing the forest through the trees.
Well, they're my favorite countries.
Slovenia is very nice. America has national vital interests across the European continent. We don't defend Europe. We don't enhance our defense spending
We're going to
for
get
NATO's
to Europe,
alliance
so keep it more general.
for these countries' interests, but because of our own economic, political, and security interests. If you look at where U.S. military bases are around Europe and what they're used for, they're primarily used for overseas contingency operations that serve American interests. When we talk about where American resources are going, it's not actually all flooding into NATO. Part of the pivot has taken place. 60% of America's defense spending goes to the Pacific, where, yes, we would like to see Europe play a stronger hand, but this pivot is happening. So again, I think we need to take a step back from, are we defending Slovenia, to, are we contributing to a defense mechanism and alliance that supports our own national interests overseas, whether they be economic or security? And I think that is the crux behind a NATO alliance, not individual aggressive actions that we may have to be called on to defend. Last point, because NATO was evoked, the only time that Article 5 has been pursued by NATO was in defense of the United States, or when the United States called for it and NATO allies went into Afghanistan. And so I think it's also somewhat ahistorical to say that we are feeding into Europe's defenses, and Europe's defenses only by supporting the NATO alliance.
Okay. So we've got a few more minutes, so let's keep people's rejoinders real short. But Ben, I think you had something you wanted to get back, say, and then Michael, I think, as well. So
I'll waive mine, by the way.
okay.
Well, I think the learned comments of my debate adversaries are revealing in that they say that alliances solve nothing and do everything. So, they don't admit that any threats have been diminished. Russia had a GDP, the Soviet Union, had a GDP that was large relative to Western Europe, to NATO Europe. At the beginning of the Cold War, it had this massive number of men under arms relative to the Europeans. That problem was solved by the economic recovery of the EU, what became the EU, and the military balance of power is broadly in favor of the non-US countries of NATO now. That matters a great deal in stabilizing Europe before the United States lifts a finger. And we shouldn't, I think, easily overlook that. We don't have to do as much to get all these nice benefits of peace that Mike is talking about. In fact, there's a large social science literature about the causes of great power peace, which gives very little credit to the sort of benevolent hegemony of the United States. The declining value of conquest is important. The horrible memory of World War II is important. And if you want an example of where the United States is not doing very much in peace and democracy and trade broke out, look at South America, where we don't have troops stationed. We, in theory, have alliances, but it doesn't mean much. And yet they've all democratized too. So maybe it's not the United States' protection. By the way, look around at all the countries we've supposedly democratized as a result of NATO expansion, and they're the autocracies that Torrey says we ought to worry about and that NATO somehow is going to fix. NATO doesn't fix autocracies. NATO's not about democracy. It's a military alliance. So if you think there's a problem with Turkey, with Hungary, with Poland becoming a liberal, I agree with you, and that shows the weakness of NATO in terms of reforming the politics of the countries where it expanded, and it shows that we need a solution other than a military alliance.
Well, the concept, of course, was that they don't come in until they've achieved some of those standards.
And it didn't work very well, we're seeing now. I mean, we didn't achieve the lasting reforms.
We didn't allow for recidivism, basically. We didn't allow for them falling
Well,
back.
I see a lot of recidivism in Turkey right now, that's for sure, and that's a major NATO ally. So I just think, the benefits of NATO, I think, are not democratizing Turkey. I don't think that's a very good argument for what NATO is doing for us.
Yeah. David, I just want to, because you have done a lot of study of early American security policy. How have our views on alliances, I seem to remember the word entanglement. Entangling alliances always kind of paired. So how has our views of alliances changed?
Well, for just about 150 years, but of course, most wonderfully expressed by President George Washington and Jefferson and many other worries, the idea was that if we got entangled in the labyrinth of European politics, it would have a corrupting effect at home. It would entail a long list of injuries to liberty. Debt, taxes, standing armies, those were the phrases that came off their tongue at that time. And of course, when we did get involved in the labyrinth of European politics, debt, taxes, and armies followed in their train. The founders really, I think, are to be looked at not so much for their particular views about the world at that time. Obviously, the world has undergone tremendous change. The greatest source of value in studying them is their idea of what the fundamental values are. Things like liberty and justice. And they had ideas about that are very different from our own. I mean, for example, we think, or it's often said, our mission is to extend democracy and human rights across the world and bring those wonderful things to the world's peoples. And the founders said, no, sir, you had no right to do that. The people of every country had the right to choose their own institutions, and they might choose democracy, but they might choose monarchy. It was up to them. That was a fundamental human right, and Jefferson thought that. So our whole idea of what it is legitimate for us to do in the world is 180 degrees different from what that generation and the generations that came after them thought.
Any other comments on the general subject before we go on to Europe?
Many.
Michael, anything?
Sure, I'll say a piece on the entanglement issue because it keeps being brought up. I think, the United States entangles its allies into America's wars, but not really the other way around. The United States is often the trigger-happy one and cajoles its allies to follow it into wars that they themselves tried to dissuade the United States from starting. You mentioned that the United States has this diversified alliance portfolio. I would argue that's actually a good thing from a strategic standpoint because allies in one region are always trying to persuade the United States not to fight stupid wars in other regions where it will drain its resources and not be able to defend them. And we've seen this de-escalate crises numerous times throughout US history. The United States wanted to go nuclear in the Korean War. NATO allies freaked out and persuaded the United States not to do that. The United States wanted to go nuclear over a series of Taiwan Straits crises during the Cold War, over Laos and Berlin. Allies cajoled the United States not to do it. Vietnam, the United States went in, but allies were staunchly opposed. Even the Iraq War, most recently, allies tried to persuade the United States, don't go in and fight this stupid war. So we are the trigger-happy ones, and it's often allies that try to provide some kind of restraining effect. And then once we do it anyway, they provide troops and they provide money to help us get out of this quagmire that we've just got ourselves in. So we have to factor that in. The other thing I would say is there's a lot of dogs that didn't bark here, so wars that may not have happened, or wars that could have been prevented through forming a bright line with an alliance. So the Korean War, right before the Korean War, how did that start? We removed the Korean peninsula from our defensive perimeter, and North Korea took that as a green light to invade the South. In the Iraq War in 1991, we gave mixed signals to Saddam Hussein whether we were actually going to defend Kuwait. As a result, he took that as a green light to move in. Ukraine is not a NATO ally. Guess who got invaded by Russia most recently, as opposed to who didn't get invaded? So there's lots of cases where these alliances have nipped conflicts in the bud, where they've tried to persuade the United States not to fight stupid wars, and where they've provided burden sharing to take some of the edge off of the dumb wars that we get ourselves into.
Ben, do you see
United
us as doing the entangling?
The United States self-entangles as a result of alliances. So we're in danger of going off into an academic debate here, and I want to avoid that. But his definition of entanglement basically defines it away. He says it's only when you when you do something that's not in your interest. Well, we have these alliances. They last 40 years. Everybody's saying how important they are and how great the threats that create them are in U.S. domestic politics. And lo and behold, we expand the idea of interest we have. And we expand the idea even in Vietnam, right? Vietnam is a case where the Allies indeed said, the European Allies didn't want us to do it. But one of the reasons we did it was because we thought we had to fight communism there because of the effects on our allies. Same with, in a limited way, the war in Libya that we foolishly fought in the Obama administration. So the United States self-entangles as a result of alliances. So to me, that's entrapment. Maybe we can come up with different nouns for it. But it's a problem of alliances, and it gets to a broader point, which is alliances are the fuel of global militarism. They help us have wars that we shouldn't have. They help convince the American people through the way they're justified in American politics, through rampant threat inflation, that we need to be everywhere, doing everything, defending everything. They're dangerous. They're not nice, liberal, happy things all the time. Again, they're about military might. So I think we need to think about these things a little differently. I'm not against defending Kuwait in 1991 necessarily, or all these wars. My position, and I think David's, is not that we should have zero alliances ever, but just that they're not this endless font of good and happiness and trade and democracy and wars that otherwise would have been fought.
Torrey, Ben's just attacked your alliance partner, Michael. Maybe you can come to Michael's defense here?
Well, a lot's been brought up about this question of democracy and authoritarianism and what role American alliances have in this. If we go to the NATO Charter, actually Article 2 of the NATO Charter calls on all member states to uphold free institutions at the core of their domestic political system. Is that a perfect alliance structure? No. Have we seen Greece and Turkey and Portugal, NATO members at times backslide on some of those values? Yes, absolutely. But NATO, even though it is not the foremost actor to be dealing with democratic backsliding, also serves as a forum for liberal democratic states to push back on some of these tendencies. Just to pick up on the Turkey thread earlier, yes, Turkey is moving in negative, concerning directions, but one way, I think, to try to maintain Turkey in the Western orbit is to keep it a part of Western military alliances, to keep strong ties between the EU and Turkey, not to compromise on our values, but to show the appeal of being part of a Western community, a Western camp that comes with economic benefits, that comes with stable domestic political societies. And secondly, just on the democracy note, yes, we're seeing entrenchment of authoritarian systems within Russia and China, and no, it is not America's place to determine what sort of governments other countries have in the world, but we should be on strong defense when these authoritarian influences come within our borders, come within our alliance systems, seek to exploit fissures and divisions within our own societies, as we've seen Russia. Or if we see China increasing debt among developing countries around the world, I know we're getting outside the alliance picture here, but these are developments that take place outside of authoritarian countries' borders and that very much impact our interests in alliance countries and outside of them.
David?
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about the democracy situation in Europe because it really does look different than it did 10 or 15 years ago. We were so excited when the Poles and the Czechs and the Hungarians escaped the prison house of nationalities that was the Soviet alliance system and the Soviet Union. And we're thrilled that they were turning to democracy, but there's been backsliding. Robert Kagan, a colleague of Torrey's, wrote in his last book that democracy is lost in Poland, in the Czech Republic, and Hungary. Of course, it's definitely lost in Turkey. Now, what is the response of the United States to that bad behavior? Oh, we're going to support you 100%. We're going to put a base in Poland. We're going to build up NATO. Well, how is that understood in Warsaw and Prague? And Budapest. Oh, we can do whatever we want. There's no pushback whatsoever from the United States. I mean, the truth is that those alliance commitments that we have fulfill this, categorical imperative to be nasty to the Russians. And the effect that it has on the domestic structures of our allies is extremely limited. Now, those two things have to be in tension with one another, because at the end of the day, if you say to the Poles and the Hungarians and the Czechs, 100% we support you, well then, they draw the obvious conclusion that there's no pressure coming from Washington.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think that we can really put much pressure on them, because I think that what's happening there responds to very deep-seated things. They've lost 10% of their population. They don't have a voice in EU councils. Their economic growth is pretty pathetic. Their decisions are made in Berlin that they have to accept a certain number of Muslim refugees, and they say, hey, we didn't make that decision. Why are you telling us what we have to do? So those things are real big changes that have happened in Eastern Europe. They respond to very fundamental historical shifts that's, kind of beyond the control of Washington to really shape in a productive direction.
Torrey, if you could, in answering David, could you also address the question, should NATO, because we're kind of into the European section here, should NATO have a means to kick people out? And I don't want to start on Brexit, but should NATO have a means to kick people out who have kind of gone in the right direction? And by the way, those are very strong comments. Democracy is lost.
Well, it was Bob Kagan who said that.
Yeah, but
We
not
have to
me.
finish the.
I don't believe everything that Bob Kagan says.
It's typically
but,
overstated.
Well, there's a problem there.
Yeah.
I mean, we could go through item by item and talk about the things that have happened there, and I agree with you that that's a little extreme, but there are disturbing things.
Okay.
We have to finish the Bob Kagan analogy. I feel bad he's not here and we're all channeling him. But the second piece
would
of
be
this
proud. Yeah.
return of the jungle, this loss of democracy, is that this is a garden, so to speak, that needs to be pruned, that needs to be maintained, that needs to be looked after, because international systems, peace, prosperity that Michael mentioned at the beginning, want to collapse. Historical forces are often trying to pull countries back into dictatorship. Nationalist forces are constantly being quelled. And if you don't pay attention to those, if you don't try to maintain institutions and alliances that have kept the peace and prosperity broadly, we do fall back into these more historical forces that Kagan mentions in the loss of the jungle. But on the issue of NATO, and should we be kicking members out that, I'm going to assume you meant, that don't necessarily abide by the values of the Charter, the spirit of the Charter, this is a difficult question. There's actually not an official mechanism by which NATO can kick out a member state. And so we're stuck for the moment with our strange bedfellows, with trying to use this forum to push back on what we're seeing in Turkey. To David's point about we were thrilled when Poland and Hungary moved forward at the end of the Cold War, and now we're issuing them guarantees without any sort of reprisal. I think that's a critique of Trump administration foreign policy and not of America's commitment to U.S. alliances. I think if you had a different administration in place, you would see greater pushback against the diminishment of rule of law, of separation of powers, of independent justice that we're seeing in these partner states that we're just not under this administration.
Ben, there are some countries, Poland is one of them, that are actually increasing their defense spending. Poland's just bought a whole new squadron of F-35s to go with their F-18s. And so Poland is doing the spending. I guess the question is, what about the others and this 2% national goal? And how should we, should we do what President Trump has been doing, which is, pretty singling them out? Or should we understand that there are kind of different roles for different folks here?
I think what the Trump administration has done in Europe is sort of the worst of both worlds, in that, we're berating the allies and upsetting them and harming relations, and then we're not even doing what I think we ought to be doing, which is just taking U.S. garrisons out, not all of them necessarily, but cutting down on the amount of bases we have. If you want them to do more, doing less at least gives you a fighting chance of motivating to do that. Otherwise, you're just undercutting the message that you're sending with your mouth with the troops that you're deploying. So no, I think we have the wrong approach, and I think, again, we should give them more autonomy. So I think the big mistake over time that the United States has made, in my view, vis-a-vis, or a big mistake vis-a-vis NATO, is to use it basically to prevent the EU from developing independent military capability. The Eisenhower administration wanted a European army. They didn't get it because of European problems, essentially. And now we're terrified by that idea. Everybody has learned this religion of primacy that says no other big powers, even if they're our friends, are allowed to have their own capabilities. They have to be sidekicks. I think it would be terrific if the Europeans had that independent capability. In a perverse sense, Brexit could help with that. And I will just say to finish that, I just had this image in my mind of with the pruning the garden of democracy of Boris Johnson and Donald Trump with these cheers, trying to make democracy in Europe. And I don't mean to be dismissive of the idea, but it does kind of get at the hubris, doesn't it? It's not a little garden that we prune. It's difficult. It's hard. And I don't know that we, even in a different administration, have all the answers. And besides that, the idea that it's NATO, a military alliance, is the way, the cudgel, the one tool of diplomacy, or the main tool of diplomacy among many, that we use to try to encourage democracy and liberalism, I think is a really impoverished and kind of militarized idea that we learned from the Cold War. I mean, I don't think we have a great chance at driving those societies where we want them to go, but I'm not sure that a military alliance, especially one that we already expanded there, is the main tool to get them where we want.
Michael, when we've had discussions about burden sharing with the Republic of Korea, we always tell them NATO is the gold standard. NATO, it's an alliance of countries, shared values, shared understanding of how they need to work together. What do you think? Is that still true?
I wouldn't call it the gold standard by any stretch of the imagination. I think, but on the other hand, folks like Ben, I think, make a big deal about sort of spending targets. How much are they spending every year on defense? And this magical, as if every NATO country.
No, to be clear, I don't care if they spend more. I care if they get better at having independent.
Okay, well then there, I think we agree. I would say, from an alliance management perspective, though, what I've often advocated is more of a division of labor strategy. We can't expect all of our allies to develop global power projection capabilities near anything what the United States has, nor should we want them to. I mean, oftentimes our allies complain that Americans are kind of schizophrenic. They say, spend more on defense, build a big military. But then they say, don't build a big military, don't militarize,
Yeah.
I would rather be in a world where Japan has, a restrained military, where South Korea is not going nuclear to deter North Korea, where NATO allies provide capabilities that complement U.S. forces as opposed to their own aircraft carriers that they can sail around and do God knows what. So I think, there's a fine line that we can draw here between encouraging burden sharing but not demanding that they somehow become, great powers in their own right militarily.
Let me ask David and Torrey, starting with David. So should NATO just keep enlarging? I mean, should it not only take in Ukraine, which has been a subject of some consternation, but should it just keep moving eastward? I mean, why not? Should we just bring in the Republic of Korea into NATO and, we're done?
Kazakhstan is my candidate.
Kazakhstan, okay.
Well,
Share our values.
don't laugh, because if you read NATO communiques, they take a very strong interest in developments in Central Asia.
Yeah.
And the aspiration of the United States is very global. Should we bring in Ukraine? No, I don't think so. In fact, I want to say a few words about that, because Torrey mentioned the revisionist objectives of Russia. Let's think about how that crisis in 2014 went down. You all know what a democracy is, right? You get 500,000 people and in the streets of the capital city and overthrow the government. Isn't that how it works in America? Oh no, it isn't. We have elections, don't we? They didn't have elections. They had a change of government, of regime, of who held the police power, that was produced by 500,000 people in a nation of 45 million. Well, where were the little old ladies? Did they not get a say? No, they didn't. The angry young men did. They forced Yanukovych out. That was a great victory for democracy. It wasn't. It was a tarnished image of democracy that went down in Ukraine. What is this alliance system? I think a lot about alliances as kind of like marriages. You know, there's an exchange of vows, there are fights. This is not a modern marriage. This is a patriarchy with one big daddy with ties to about 60 different countries around the world, none of whom stand equal with Papa and spend about a 20th or a 100th of what they do on defense. And that distorts decision-making. That creates a relationship that's not quite friendship. And I think that we need friendship with these countries. I like the Germans. I admire the Japanese. I admire the South Koreans. I want them to be prosperous. But they have to also take care of themselves, stand up, take responsibility for their security issues, and frequently it's the United States that prevents that. If you look at the Korean Peninsula today, I know we'll get to that.
We will.
I hate to do it, but who's obstructed the peace negotiations there? We have a great president in Moon in South Korea. And who's preventing progress there? The United States of America.
Okay. Torrey, NATO enlargement, you want to see more of it? We haven't talked about Georgia and, yeah.
So we're at a point in time now where I think the NATO alliance has decided that it's important to consolidate our member states. We've mentioned a lot of divisions and fracturing and problems that the alliance is dealing with, and that expansion is not the right movement for now. But I agree with what Michael said earlier, that there are those dogs that don't bark, that those wars that didn't start, that we don't know why. And had Ukraine and Georgia become members in 2008 when they were promised a membership action plan. They weren't promised action plans, but promised potential and future membership. It's hard to tell whether Russia would have intervened in the Ukraine. I do also have to push back on this depiction of the Maidan movement. This was not just angry men forcing out Yanukovych. If we recall why this started in 2014, it was because Ukraine was potentially deciding on joining a EU association agreement, and then Yanukovych pulled it off the table, and the people came into the streets because they wanted closer ties with the European Union over Russia. Russia's primary toolkit in its near abroad is opportunistic, asymmetric capabilities that it employed when it had a moment of instability in Crimea, and has since started a war that has killed over 16,000 people in Ukraine, in the Donbass. And so to say that this was started by young, angry men, on the streets of Kyiv, I think is inaccurate, and unfortunately is a narrative that we hear all too often coming from the Kremlin. So I'm surprised to hear it coming from you as well.
Is that really a democratic method to change a government through street demonstrations? I mean, I don't think so. And I think it has consequences because it puts the country into a kind of state of nature in which if one side gets to use force, the other side does too, and that's exactly what happened.
Well, look, we can go down a rabbit hole of what democracy should look like in Ukraine. I'm not sure that's the point of this discussion, but the point is when we were looking at Ukraine as a potential NATO ally in 2008, we left it out to dry by promising membership and then not moving forward with that. But when it does come to this separate point of the Maidan movement, I think that it's vastly overstating that these were, hooligans in the streets tearing down a government.
It's not that they were hooligans, it's that they violated democratic procedures. I mean, you could have a big demonstration of 1 million people in Washington, D.C. that was fighting for the most righteous cause imaginable. But if they overturned the government, you'd have anarchy and civil war in the United States.
Well, if you look at the previous elections that took place in Ukraine that Yanukovych won, those weren't necessarily the most democratic procedures that we could imagine. There's tremendous amount of corruption there.
Okay.
Sometimes people feel that that's the only way to enact change.
Okay, I think Torrey's going to get the last word on Wither Ukraine. I do want to turn to Ben for a short comment and then ask Michael to kind of sketch out U.S. interests in Asia and maybe compare and contrast our alliance systems in Asia versus Europe. I mean, after all, we have bilateral alliances in Asia, and they don't connect with each other. They just, we have a relationship with Japan, we have a relationship with South Korea, and believe me, South Korea and Japan don't have a relationship. So I'd like Michael to kind of go through this, but let me first turn to Ben for a closing comment.
Well, I find it confusing why Torrey, you would favor expanding NATO to Georgia and Ukraine in 2008 and not be in
I
favor.
didn't. I said the procedure by which they offered but then didn't move forward left
You
them out to
suggested
dry.
that it would have saved them from being invaded, and I think
That it's,
number
we
one,
will never know.
Right, and I think, yeah, but what we do know, number one, is that the mere prospect of entering NATO, even though it turned out not to be a promise the United States was going to honor, maybe encourage the Georgian government to start a war with Russia in 2008 that it wasn't ready for, is moral hazard, even without the actual alliance. Number two, Ukraine, as you just mentioned, is a kleptocratic country. It has major internal divisions. I have nothing against it. I have ancestors from there. But who wants to fight a war, and potentially a nuclear war, and have people they know die on behalf of Ukraine? That's what we're talking about doing. That's what expanding NATO to Ukraine in 2008 means. Deterrent threats aren't entirely free. You have to act on those threats every now and then for people to believe them. So I think we've become so casual in thinking there's never deterrence failure, you never get called on your bluffs, you can threaten to defend any state, and it will just work out great. The Russians will fold their tent and basically forget about the fact that you just expanded NATO to their border. So there's all these costs that come, not just the threat of war, the possibility of war and dead people, from making these sorts of threats. And I think we should be a little more cautious about the consequences of expanding NATO, whether it's 2008 or now.
Okay. I got to give Torrey a rejoinder. Do you want to just take a second?
No, I think we've already not lived up to promises we've made Ukraine. I mean, the Budapest Memorandum in 1994 said that if Ukraine removed their nuclear weapons, the West would protect its borders, and we
No, it
haven't.
didn't.
And so
It
this
didn't say the
wasn't
West would
necessarily moral hazard that has played out regardless.
But it didn't say the West would protect the borders. It said the West would, I don't remember the exact language, but it's short of a military threat on purpose. And I think it's really important when we have all these alliances to be clear about the countries we're not going to defend. So you talk about bright lines. If you're worried about credibility, saying we're going to defend Ukraine, which we never said, but pretending we did say that, and then it's a terrible failure of the Obama administration not to live up to its promises, that's how you maybe generate real credibility failure in the countries we actually plan to defend, where we confuse where those lines are.
Okay. I think we've done Ukraine.
No, there's more to say.
It's not even an hour.
So, Michael, why don't you take it on the alliance system in Asia, and then we'll get into these questions of, is this a problem that we just have sort of hub and spokes and we have no means to bring people together?
Okay, well, I'm sure we'll have no disagreement on Asia as compared to Europe. I would say the main interests in Asia, and this is in U.S. documents, is to prevent any country from dominating the region, from becoming a hegemon. Right now, the most likely is obviously China. Maintaining freedom of navigation and trade and investment, preventing the spread of nuclear weapons, and promoting democracy and human rights. These are all longstanding interests. And I think in each of these four areas, allies can be extremely helpful. So in terms of preventing regional hegemony and and maintaining freedom of navigation, I mean, China has staked claim to 80 to 90% of the East and South China Seas, and a huge chunk of American trade goes through there. It's really helpful to have a chain of U.S. allies who are each determined to prevent China from taking control of the seas that are off of their coast. Otherwise, we'd have to do it ourselves with aircraft carriers that are increasingly vulnerable to China's improving military capabilities. So having frontline countries on the ground helps accomplish those U.S. interests. Nuclear proliferation. U.S. alliances have substituted for the nuclear weapons programs of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. We have documentary evidence that shows they forewent these because the United States said, we will protect you in lieu of you developing nuclear weapons. I think that has prevented a massive arms race in East Asia that could have escalated to the use of nuclear weapons. And then in terms of democracy and human rights, in the past, the United States has used its alliance ties to pressure its client states to liberalize their political system. So in the case of Taiwan and South Korea, how did they go from dictatorship to democracy? Part of the reason was US pressure when American policymakers said, look, if you continue to want our protection, you have to also listen to how we think you should treat your own people. I wish, frankly, the United States would do that more. I think, contrary to what Ben argued earlier, that NATO, these alliances have nothing to do with the spread of democracy. I think that the United States actually has a fair amount of leverage over its allies, because it's like if you want the protection of the world's only superpower, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, maybe you better start treating your people a little bit better.
David, you're also a political scientist, but I'm counting on you as being a historian as well. And I just want to know, why did we never develop collective security there? I mean, we had ideas, we had things like CETO and things like
Well,
that.
yeah,
but it never
you had
developed.
this little problem that the Japanese and the Koreans were at one another's throats. So you just didn't have the kind of situation that you had in Europe that would enable a kind of multilateral collective defense organization in Asia.
Did we not try hard enough? Because there are a few European countries at each other's
I don't
throats.
think so. I mean,
thinking about
I don't really have an answer to that question, but I do have some answers to what Michael said. So
Okay.
I wanted to talk about those three things, and those are very interesting points. I think the first one is really lacks a solid foundation, although the second is very real and about nuclear weapons. The trade that passes through the South China Sea, yeah, we have a stake in that. China's stake is about 5 to 6 times greater. I mean, of that $5 trillion that passes through there every year, 4/5 of it is either to or from China. China has a fundamental interest in the maintenance of the freedom of the seas, and it's not going to challenge that. If it's a revisionist power, it's essentially a revisionist power with regard to Taiwan. And it's been a revisionist power since 1949. That issue has gone on since the end of the Chinese Civil War. It's a difficult one to resolve. The nuclear question is tough, definitely. I don't think that, and we could talk about that, with respect to human rights, the United States played a role there, in the Philippines, for example. I think its role in South Korea, the history there is a bit darker because we were pretty strong proponents or supporters of the authoritarian regime. It was the people of South Korea that brought about democracy in that country. And I think our ability to, consulting the founders, what did they say about spreading human rights and democracy? They said, set a good example. So physician, heal thyself with regard to democratic practices and the appropriate conduct of the President of the United States and how he is to address people with respect and dignity. There's a set of things happening in this country that we need to focus on because that is our business and that's our most important value. And the idea that we're going to really change the world by having diplomats give lectures, I think is mistaken. You change the world by showing you have a really successful system that works and that people will want to emulate. And that's what happened in the 90s. And unfortunately, the tides of history have overtaken us and there's been a regression, but there's very little that the United States can do to arrest that, I think.
Torrey, back during the George W. Bush administration, Secretary Rumsfeld realized that the U.S.-Korean alliance is really only in respect of the issue of North Korea. That is, Rumsfeld wanted the South Koreans to agree that we could use airfields and other assets in Korea, pre-positioned in Korea, for so-called third country ops. The South Koreans, when they heard third country, they thought, who do you have in mind? And obviously it was the perception of the biggest threat there, which is China. So we have very narrow alliances there. Is that appropriate? Should the South Koreans have said, sure, be my guest, use Osan Air Base if you want to attack China?
Well, I'm not a Korea expert, but I do think as we look at our alliance structures in Asia, we do need to go through kind of a fundamental reassessment as they deal with a rising China. I mean, I'm not trying to whitewash a situation or make it sound more simplistic to say that this is the most difficult partnership, difficult competitor, and perhaps adversary that the United States will have to deal with in the coming decades. And just to bring up a few points that Michael raised earlier, these alliance structures in place have helped to maintain peace and stability and prosperity in this region where, as David also alluded to, we have tremendous interest in the South China Sea where it comes to freedom of navigation, free trade, whether the Chinese would close those passages? I don't think so. But if we get into a wartime or confrontational setting, it's unclear. And so I think, when it comes to alliances with Korea and Japan and those in Southeast Asia, even though they're not formal alliance settings, we need to be taking into consideration how these will adapt to a rising China in the year ahead. I don't think containment is an option. I don't think that that's a possibility for the U.S. to pursue when it comes to China. But we're going to have to fundamentally reassess and rethink alliances in a region that's looking very different because of growing Chinese hegemony.
Okay, Ben, are we confronting Chinese hegemony forthrightly? Are we doing the right thing? Is it right to be steaming our Navy through the South China Sea, or is the Chinese would like to look at it as a southern Chinese lake?
I think that, number one, believe it or not, Asia has what I would call, or what Bob Ross, who's a political scientist, called a geography of peace. Major powers are separated by major bodies of water. And if you think back to World War II, it was very hard for the Germans to get across the English Channel, let across the Atlantic Ocean. Bodies of water pacify. The Pacific Ocean is aptly named. So there's really not a credible threat of the Chinese conquering Japan. That's not a real threat. The technological trends of defensive weapons, of missiles and surveillance systems are making it easier to defend coastlines, not harder. So Mike Beckley wrote a good article about this. There's a defense dominance in Asia that is tremendously good news, because for the United States, we're a status quo power in Asia, where we defend the existing borders, unlike in the Middle East. And so as a status quo power, defense dominance is good. It means that we can rely much more heavily on our allies, who can do some of the things the Chinese have done in terms of improving their defensibility, adopting more hedgehog-like strategies where they're harder to swallow, including Taiwan, which is not really our ally. And if we did that, I think we could participate a lot less in the defense of Asia, which would improve U.S.-China relations, because they're worried about our offensive striking capability. Even if we say we're defending our allies, they look at capabilities that could potentially unseat their government. And so there's a sort of security dilemma spiral type dynamic that allied defenses don't create on their own. Finally, I think Mike's assumption, he was saying, well, it's good to have states, allies in Asia who do things defensively that will potentially complicate Chinese expansionism, if that's what they're interested in. And of course that's true, but that assumes that they would just be sitting on their hands without the United States prompting them. And of course states balance power. They balance power through their own means and through their own alliances. So those states, I think, have, depending on which ones we're talking about, plenty of capability before the United States even gets involved to help balance China and stop whatever possible, unlikely expansionist aims it has beyond a couple islands and the very thorny problem of Taiwan.
Michael, you're going to have the final word on Asia before we transit over to the Persian Gulf.
Well, I'll keep it short, because as I predicted, I actually agree with pretty much everything Ben just said. I guess I think
divide and conquer.
I think
Three
we
against
agree.
one.
Michael, you're not helping our case.
I would say the only thing is I feel like we should form a Northeast Asian Treaty Organization, because the acronym would be NATO, which would be kind of nice. But other than that, everything Ben just said is right. We should maintain these alliances, but rely more on our allies to reinforce this sort of natural defense dominance, where it's just very hard to project military power across bodies of water. Our allies occupy what the Chinese call the first island chain, this archipelago that stretches all the way from Japan down through Taiwan, the Philippines, all the way down to Indonesia. And that helps them sort of fend off China near their coastlines using asymmetric strategies, using missile forces, cyber attacks, et cetera. I think the U.S. can do stuff to help around the margins, but I basically agree with Ben that the U.S. allies can be asked to do a lot there. They just need American backing, that's all.
Okay, great. Well, let's move on to the Persian Gulf. And there, I think we have a completely different kind of alliance system, if we can call it a system. But I guess one of the first questions is, how do we manage the sort of growing divergence of interests with our NATO ally, which to some extent is our Ottoman Turkish ally right now, a country, Turkey, that is really kind of taken a renewed interest in the Middle East and somewhat of a different interest. And then how do we manage the divergence of interests we have with the Turks, but also with Saudi Arabia Where should we start with that? Ben, would you like to?
Sure.
Okay.
I mean, number one, I think that we have to have a more distant relationship from Turkey. There's a short-term problem, hopefully short-term problem, of getting them not to murder Kurds in Syria who we've been looking after. And I think, to me, the only real long-term solution to that is to accept the fact that the Syrian government, like it or not, is going to be ruling Syria again, and probably that part of Syria. And the Kurds had an accommodation with them before that assured their survival, and they could have one again. But we've been blocking that, as far as I understand, because we have different ideas about the future of Syria. So I think if we could live with that, we could at least mitigate our problems with Turkey and maybe head for the exits in
And
Syria.
you heard they've asked 1 million Kurds, or ask is maybe the wrong verb, but to return to 1 million Syrians to return to Syria as of today.
I did not hear that, but yeah. So we haven't handled that well. More broadly, I think that we should essentially. I don't think we should make Saudi Arabia our enemy. I don't think we should be overly punitive towards them. But what I do think we should do is not be their great friend or their quasi-ally anymore through weapon sales, through supporting their horrible war in Yemen, and through our horrible fixation on Iran, which, you know, like it or not, is, I don't think, this great threat to take over the Middle East. I mean, their military capability to actually go places and do things, you know, leaving aside writing checks to actors like Hezbollah, is very limited. So there's an ugly balance of power in the Middle East that I don't think we ought to be managing. So there's one place where I think the basic strategy that I would recommend is heading for the exits. And the last 20 years of U.S. foreign policy, I think, if you look at it in that part of the world, makes the case better. I know you have personal experience there, but makes the case better than I could, I think, just looking and saying, well, we got heavily involved. How did that go? Yeah. You know, maybe it would be better to have a more hands-off, you know, call it offshore balancing or distant approach.
Yeah. David, yeah, I think you wanted to say something.
Yeah, well, I endorse those very sensible comments by my colleagues. I think the thing I want to add is to talk a little bit about what we're doing vis-a-vis Iran. You know, Secretary of State Pence has laid down 12 demands.
Pompeo.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. I got those confused, didn't I? You know, one of those guys, his name starts with P. 12 demands. That's regime change. I mean, the 13th demand would be the appointment of an American regent to run the country out of Washington, D.C. And those demands amount to a denial of the rights of the sovereign state of Iran to protect itself, to pursue its interest. Now, every state has those rights. It can forfeit them when it does things which are especially terrible, but I don't think that you can get that from the Iranian record, despite all of these denunciations as Iran as the world's foremost sponsor of terrorism. Well, they supported the poor folks in Yemen, the Houthis, who are getting slaughtered by the Saudis. I don't think that rises to a major crime, and their support has been actually fairly modest. They support their people in Lebanon, Hezbollah, who got obliterated by the Israelis in 2006. The entire South Beirut, where they had their headquarters, flattened. Well, traditionally, if someone gets flattened by an external force, they have a right to protect themselves. And I think those people do have a right to protect themselves.
So,
we don't think so.
Yeah.
We want to overthrow that regime, and we're getting close to having a war with them. Because when you try to asphyxiate a regime, deprive it of oxygen, Trump has gone much further than Bush ever went.
Yeah.
You know, you get the circumstances of a war a la 1941. Now, the Iranians don't want a war with us. But of course, that shows that our whole idea of what they're about, that they're going to take over the Middle East, is untrue. Because they won't even go to war when they're pressed so severely as we're doing now when we try to deny their capacity to export oil.
Michael and Torrey, you agree that there's too much fixation on Iran in our Gulf strategy?
Well, I think the overall tenor of the situation in the Middle East is that it's an ugly balance of power that the United States cannot manage. But when we focus on Iran in particular, the way that the United States in recent years sought to manage this problem, not to fundamentally transform the regime, but manage the Iranian nuclear issue, was through the Iranian nuclear accords, hammered out along with American allies. And in pulling out of that accord, we are already seeing a diminishing of support from European allies in helping U.S. interests, but also in maintaining stability in the region. So in recent months, recent weeks, we've seen the Iranians taking and seizing oil tankers. And the United States called on European partners to do more, to do a phone-up through Strait of Hormuz, to show that it cared about freedom of navigation in this region. And because I was in Germany at the time, it was a very chaotic domestic political issue, because if Germany lent support to this region and was seen as being in the U.S. orbit, supporting a U.S. policy, that was a big issue to sell to the German people who so vehemently disagree with Trump's decision to pull out of the nuclear accords. So it's a very roundabout way of saying that in pulling out of multilateral agreements, institutions, whether or not you agree with them, has a shadow on the future for asking those same partners for help in pursuing U.S. interests in policies, as we're seeing play out with Iran now.
We've achieved consensus. I agree.
Okay. Well, not yet, because we haven't heard from Michael.
Oh.
All right.
I defer. I know I'm like contractually obligated to defend every U.S. ally to the death here, but in the Middle East, I can't do it. I can't defend the Saudis. I can't defend Turkey. I agree with my colleagues. I think U.S. foreign policy there has been overly interventionist and highly skewed with horrible consequences.
And the Israelis, I think, are guilty of some moral hazard, too. I would just say, I don't think we disagree about the Iran deal. I would just say that that is not an achievement of alliances. It was an achievement of diplomacy. It remains an achievement. It's still in place. And it was diplomacy not just between the U.S. and its NATO allies, but China and Russia, adversaries. So, so we agree. I don't think we get to chalk that up as a victory for U.S. military alliances. I think my side of the debate is also in favor of diplomacy in situations like that, certainly.
Okay.
Yeah, that's to return to the point that Michael made earlier about listening to allies. I do agree with that. I mean, regardless of the nature of the commitment and the way that these alliances change over the future, we have good friends abroad, and they have good sense very frequently about things. That's actually a lesson from the founders. Madison has a wonderful passage about this in the Federalist Papers, where he says, you should always pay attention to what the disinterested part of mankind thinks about you. That's the judgment. You want to try to persuade people and pay a decent respect for the opinions of mankind, as Jefferson put it in the Declaration. That's very important. And one of the, I think, problems that has come from the incredible power that the United States has disposed of in the world over the last generation is that we kind of forgot how to do that.
Yeah.
And that was one of the great keys of the success of U.S. foreign policy in Europe after the Second World War. We paid attention to what Adenauer thought.
Yeah.
We paid attention to what Churchill thought. That was important to the American government. I don't think that is important at all to the American government anymore. Maybe it was for Obama to a certain extent, but it's not at all for Trump, and that's very sad.
Yeah. Okay, so we are down to the penultimate event, which is each of you will now give us a 2-minute closing, and then I've got a few Q's and A's, and we should wrap up here pretty soon, but probably just a tad bit later than our 7 o'clock requirement. So I'm going to go in reverse order and start with Torrey.
I had prepared closed remarks, but there's been so much rich discussion on the stage that I want to address some of it and then re-emphasize why I think alliances are more important today than in any time since the end of the Cold War. And we've talked about alliances, free riding, infantilization, temptation and moral hazard to drag America into wars not of its choosing. But I think if we look at recent history and even longer history, that has not been the case. And I think that this position ignores that America has very strong interests in Europe, in Asia, that it defends not out of some selfless form of goodwill, but in the interest and in defense of vital American interests, defense of its citizens, trade, security. And this is why we invest in alliances, not to defend Slovenia's sovereignty or potential aggression in the future. And this gets back to this moment that we find ourselves in, this crossroads of being in an era that's the most democratic, peaceful, prosperous that we've all lived through, and seeing very worrying trends on the horizon, return of authoritarianism, resurgence of authoritarianism around the world in our own societies, and also revisionist powers, whether it be Russia, China, Iran, or others that are pushing on the borders of a fracturing international system. And if I were in US government, or if I had to say over these decisions, I would rather deal with these forces with friends than alone.
Okay. Thank you. David?
I wanted to make a point about the authoritarian axis, the Russia, China, Iran thing that has become now a big selling point for America's and alliances. And just to make the observation that in strategy, traditionally, the objective is to divide your enemies. And what we've done over the last 10 years has united them. The only place where China would conceivably consider territorial aggression is Siberia. And the Russians know that. And that's why they have always wanted a good relationship with the West. But we have put them into China's arms in a big way, and probably in a way that can't be changed, even with a different diplomatic approach on our part. The second theme I want to mention, and this is partly special pleading, because as an historian, I spent a lot of time reading the founders' papers and the 19th century, and got to know all of those characters pretty well, the Jeffersons and Madisons and Hamiltons and Washingtons and Clays and Calhouns and Websters and Lincolns and Sewards. And there's tremendous wisdom in that. And the funny thing is that if you go to graduate school in political science, you will not read a single one of those people if your specialty is international relations. Never. It's all European. It's all these, realpolitik characters like Frederick the Great that you read about. And I'm telling you, the real deal is our country and the contribution that our presidents, our founders, their successors made to thinking about, what it's all about in terms of what are the fundamental values associated with a foreign policy. So I want to call for a sweeping educational reform at the University of Denver and make sure that the Federalist Papers, all of Lincoln's papers, and Seward's papers are part of our curriculum, because it will bring about the dawn of a new day.
Duly noted. All right. Michael, and if you have any suggestions for the University of Denver, we'll accept them from you as well.
So in addition to reading more of the Founding Fathers, I think we should read some of the strategists from other countries that we're having to deal with. So I'm a China scholar by training. I spend a lot of time talking to Chinese strategists about how they think about American power. And I'm always struck because the one thing they seem to all agree on is that the core of US power, the key advantage that the United States still retains over China, is its alliances. To the Chinese, it's obvious that it's really helpful to lead a posse of 60-plus countries that collectively account for 75% of the global economy and 75% of global military spending, that hold the highest positions in all the major international institutions, that grant the United States base access, give it diplomatic support, cooperation on export controls, military burden sharing, intelligence sharing, tech sharing. The United States gets this and more from its alliances, and the Chinese really appreciate this because their only treaty ally is North Korea, which at this point seems to give them nothing but panic attacks and no else. Yet somehow we here in the United States tend to take alliances for granted. We take for granted that dozens of the world's most powerful countries have formed this sort of bizarre Kantian community where democracy and free trade are the norm and where war among alliance members is basically unthinkable. We also tend to take for granted that countries host the American military and then send their own sons and daughters to fight in America's wars, even some of the wars that they themselves opposed. So I agree with my colleagues that the United States can and should get tough with its allies from time to time, but I disagree because I think the way to do that is through engagement, not by tearing up alliance agreements or turning our backs on them. I think alliance commitments give the United States leverage, which it can then use to push its partners to do things that are more in line with U.S. interests. Whereas griping over the minutia of who spent what on defense in any given year or a trade deal, I think kind of misses this big picture. So the United States can reform its alliances, but it also needs to recommit to them.
Ben, your cleanup here.
Well, I think that when we talk about griping over minutia of alliances, you know, the Europeans got a pretty good deal from the United States where we helped defend them from a power that might have attacked them otherwise, certainly Western Germany, and they were able to recover from the war. We also gave them all sorts of separate economic benefits, and they you know, free college tuition, pensions at a young age, big state. And we're, in a sense, we paid for that. The United States paid for that. It wasn't positive sum, right? So eventually, I think that when they've developed the wealth and the capability to defend themselves more, they should defend themselves more. If they don't see a threat to deal with to defend themselves more, God bless them. They don't have to, but we can do less. So that's what we're talking about here. So a lot of this, I think, is a little bit sleight of hand to say, okay, we have interests in Europe. Of course we have interests in Europe. But defending those interests in Europe is not something that expanding NATO is helping with. It's not something that NATO is helping with very much these days. Russia, the balance of power in Russia grossly favors the NATO alliance, even if you take out the United States, if you look at military capability and GDP. Russia has a GDP smaller than Italy's. It has a GDP around the size of the Iberian Peninsula. So even if they wanted to, which it doesn't seem they do, they're not coming for their old empire. So our interests in Europe, which are important, are fairly easily protected through a balance of power that's not in great danger right now. And for reasons I already talked about, less because of China's weakness than because of the geography and technology that are evident now in East Asia, there's a similar story there. We don't have to scramble around like we are on the edge of disaster to protect our interests in Asia. Trade is going to be fine. The Chinese, the adversary we're concerned about, have a bigger interest, as David said, in that trade than we do. So we have to recognize that the world has changed and not sort of worship alliances like these religious ornaments that have been handed down to us by our forefathers, but just evaluate them. I think that sometimes we want allies when we go to war, but I think we should have allies for wars, not wars for allies. I think we should continue to evaluate and not sort of enshrine these as permanent fixtures in our politics. Okay. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I have a few audience questions, and we'll try to really move quickly because I think, I'm sorry? I have whatever was given to me. Oh. So I'm going to pose the question, and then if someone can volunteer to answer, and I don't think we need 4 answers for every question, but unless you have something you want to say that's quite different. Yes, so first question, what roles do alliance structures... Yeah, just pass them here. Yeah, because I'm trying to read them. So what roles do alliance structures have in resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict and a potential 2-state solution? Role of alliances in trying to deal with that.
I can answer that in 10 seconds. That's an easy one. That was a joke.
Yeah. Take 15 then. Yeah.
Well, kind of very little, actually. It's, you know, that is sort of a U.S.-Israel deal.
Yeah.
And the Europeans have a lot of strong opinions on that subject, but they don't get listened to much in D.C. It's a very tragic situation. I mean, I don't think a settlement's possible. I think the Israelis made very clear that they don't want one. We had a framework in Oslo, and what happened in the succeeding years? Well, they put another 500,000 settlers in the territory that was going to be the core of the Palestinian state. Yeah. So how can you even draw a border there? It's impossible. I don't know what to do about that. Yeah. But I think that's, unfortunately, the situation that we face. And I think it would be appropriate for the United States to occasionally say to the Israelis, hey, you know, we realize what you did,
I'd just say that I think Israel's an example. It's not a common example. It's a strong example of how oftentimes allies, even if they're weaker than you are, because of their stronger interests, pull you more than you pull them. And I think we see that in a large way in our politics, tragically.
Yeah. Because the second question says, our economic and military alliances with Israel and Saudi Arabia appear to enable human rights violations in Palestine and Yemen, respectively. If we're to maintain these alliances, how do we curb these consequences?
Cut the Saudis off. How about that? Say we disagree with what they're doing.
Yeah, I think the U.S.-Saudi alliance is tremendously flawed. It was an alliance that emerged out of World War II. I think primarily when the United States noticed that Saudi Arabia was sitting on a lot of oil, and FDR foresaw into the future that Saudis would be important. But it's a tremendously flawed and troubled relationship. At minimum, the United States should be using its leverage in that partnership to push back against these very troubling violations. But unfortunately, we don't see that enough.
Yeah, I think we should just be clear that Saudi Arabia, technically, legally speaking, is not a U.S. ally. We have no commitment to defend them. We just have this political habit, tradition of treating them as an ally. So, but I think a lot of the worst sort of pathologies of alliances that I talked about are evident in that relationship.
But let's be clear what's happened. I mean, we sell them hundreds of billions of dollars of arms. It's a totally corrupt relationship. We're doing it for the money and enabling them to fight these wars. And it's wrong, but it's profitable, so it continues.
Next question, based on Kagan's garden analogy, do we now have a responsibility to maintain any and all democracies with which we are allied as a foreign policy priority?
It seems like it's for Torrey. I don't know.
Torrey, you can speak for Bob Kagan here.
I really hope he's not listening, because I'm not sure he would want me to.
We'll send him the link. Yeah.
Good, good. No, I don't think American alliances have ever been about defending democracy wherever and wherever and whenever it is threatened. What we should acknowledge is that, and I think that this is where the Kagan analogy comes in, if America does not seek to manage and reform and invest in its alliances, we do see tendencies reemerge from, historical international system forces, whether that be nationalism, whether that be authoritarianism, conflict. I mean, these don't go away in the course of human history. I know that's a very Hobbesian thing to say, but I think as Americans, we've taken for granted this peace and stability, globally that we live in, when now we need to be reinvesting in alliances that have helped to maintain the peace.
David?
The American role after 1945 was to prevent aggression. It wasn't to protect democracy. We had alliances with authoritarian states, and our great idea was if you could get rid of aggression and let the peoples of the world figure it out in their own countries, that would be progress. Yeah. And I understand that norm against aggression. The people who developed that idea really did believe it after the experience of the wars, and it had, after the experience of Hitler, a lot of merit. So the big point I wanted to make, though, is that if you want to respect democracy, listen to them. Pay attention to what they think, the democratic expression of the peoples of the world. Open your ears to the South Americans, to the Europeans, to the Asians, to the Africans. That's what we don't do, and if we really respected democracy, that is the idea that the people should rule, we have an obligation to pay attention to them and not force them to our way of thinking, to try to learn something from them. That's, I think, the most vital thing that we could do to make democracy a kind of real thing in the world.
I think that the empirical record shows that the relationship between military alliances and democratization, meaningful democratization with some liberalism in there, not just holding elections like in Iraq or something, meaningful liberal democratization is non-existent, or at least very weak. So I agree with what Mike said before, that if you're heavily threatened, you're less like, for various reasons that have to do with the political results of danger, you're probably less likely to become a stable democracy. But that means when the threat is lessened one way or another, the alliance is seeking to do a lot of work. So NATO was good at the beginning of the Cold War because it helped defend European countries, and there was a side benefit that they were able to democratize because their economies were recovering and they weren't devoting large chunks of their economy to their military establishment. But when the threat diminished, which actually happened well before the end of the Cold War, really, it no longer mattered in that sense. And so that means now it's not doing a whole lot of good, if you agree with me, that the threat is relatively limited. So NATO, I don't think, is producing democracy now. If we want to help democracy, I think we need to think of other tools, other diplomatic solutions other than what we do with the NATO alliance or other military alliances.
Yeah, I will say that some of the military cooperation was thought to be something that could be helpful to democracy, to make sure militaries understand that they should not be interfering in the political process. So.
Can I just say, though, I interpreted the question not as if a U.S. ally who's a democracy has some kind of, some foreign power tampers with its democracy and tries to undermine it, should the United States come in with its military and try to nuke Russia for meddling in Estonia's elections or something like that? I interpret it as, should the United States defend the democracy of its allies? And I think the United States can do that in lots of ways that don't require coercive action of any kind, let alone military action. So should the United States be helping its allies shore up their democratic systems? Of course.
Okay, well, we have basically just scratched the surface of future of alliances. There are about 1 million things we could discuss, but I think in view of the time, we're already 12 minutes over. Our very distinguished panel has agreed to mix and mingle for the second part of the cocktail. And for those of you who have further questions, please, please ask them. And I'm just going to thank this great panel. I'm going to thank them for this terrific conversation. And I'm going to be working on a scorecard to figure out who you are. So thank you very much. And I think the bar is open, actually. So.
Oh, my goodness.